The estimate from the foundational structure of the Twitter files presumes the function of David's connection to internet companies, such as his own creation of search engines or other platforms, which then materializes its subversion by the use of freedom of speech in order to quell the centrally planned outcome under Project Mockingbird and its extensions, which applied to the Twitter files in order to be able to control the narrative, in order to manipulate the public into a suicide, as is derived by the white trashers cult, and their degeneracies, having continued for the purposes of their communism, have engaged in corporate espionage as an extension of these terrorist hate groups, which then centralize the structure in the staged faculties of the restructuring of society according to the projections in their order to make their attacks and their corrections into the redirection towards their desired outcome of the centrally planned white trash machine, which fundamentally believes in the destruction of American and the West society for the Soviet Union as derivative of the right type of white, or the super elites, super predators, which then generate the position under the presumption of the hatred of everyone else, who are to be purged in the radical revolutions and functions and proof of loyalty to the white supremacist communism, which would then engage in the function of getting them to kill each other until there are only the right type of white. In order to ascend in power, they would have to ensnare themselves into the contracted death cycles, which then would guarantee them being crippled and destroyed, strategically planned by the centrally planned economy, when they tried to prove the superiority of their position and the obligation to respect them, at which point this being expressed in several different ways, including historically with the black community's attempt to be accepted inside of the police forces or military, which would then systematically have been abused and disenfranchised from those positions, would actively be put in dangerous positions and treated with malicious contempt as they systematically cripple themselves in the progress of their ambitions, uh, leading into a deranged death cycle for their self-determined eradication, which then would collapse in the death growth program, facilitating their compliance as they apply all of the functional tricks which would have otherwise proved to them what is going to be done to them at the point that they, in their delusional psychopathy, ignore this, including the functions of the claim that they would be able to, in the pension bombs collapsing their wealth, be able to take it from g- general public and the civilian population, which then would derive their position of extraordinary superiority. But this, as an exploitation, hyper accelerated to its natural components in a practical sense, would have already stripped in the spoils of war those resources for others, which then would derive the inability for its ability to do the economic purpose of regeneration, which, vampirically sucking the power or energy or resources away from a non-regenerative system, is just a genocide. To this extent, it would be a fruitless outcome by degenerate fools who view their stupidity as superiority, as is derived by their stupidity crafted by their fake education and ascension therein. At which point, the assertion of these corporate espionage operations presumes the position of David's estimated powers, which includes the function of the taking over the malls, which was presumed, according to the original estimate system, from the original family that would have been connecting with David from Hollywood, when they would have had to have sold David Hollywood in order to have the various advantages for the Confederate policies, ascension, as they engage in necessary force to engage in political violence for the dedication of the Soviets' ambition, and therefore the assertion of David taking over the malls exponentially throughout the nation includes the function of the recrafting of it according to his particular interests and needs, which was presumed by Amazon, which took the estimate of everything that it was trying to do with Jeff Bezos, but through the mall structure instead, at which point the trucking and shipping systems from David connecting to the malls instead of the factories that Amazon's doing would have exponentially increased the viability of all of the structures, including the function of them being turned into functional security castles, which then maintains its own viable population of servants, which then being sustained at the higher level exponentially increases their viable potential, including the expansion in the outer villages structures from said mall, which then materializes the exponential increase of the material product, which increases the viability of the products and services and economic products of David's clients, who would then have in their various franchises filled all of the stores inside of the malls, which, having been guaranteed from the zombie insurance a specific amount of resources, would have stabilized according to the viable mechanisms of said village. And therefore, as long as they had participated in the rules, then they would be protected from the various collapses and subversions as derived by their various protections and insurances. The viable product of their ascensions derived by the connections of various support structures, such as the two black bankers, which then would have allied with David, hyper-accelerating the loan structures in order to have reinforced those viable business products, as the viable business products, having been certified by the zombie insurance surveying protocols, would have sustained the mechanism of the guaranteed minimum, which would have guaranteed and protected all of their needed essential payments of cost of businesses, such as the settlement of the loans, which then, having been taken over, if there was a failure, would not have been their fault as long as they had participated in that structure, maintaining the viable business structures and economic stability in progress, which is derived by retaliations by the white supremacists who have historically engaged in their murder hobo mobs from their undead insurrectionists from KKK past, which, having been fundamentally infused to their identity, is founded upon their degenerate inferiorities while asserting their superiority through violence. The only way any of them could have comparably be considered worth any kind of self-respect, which, by definition, is not inherent to their person, nor to their behavior, having no part in their viable civilian agreements, then engaged in the perpetual subversions and degeneracies natural to the type of people who would engage in those retaliations, which would be understood and crafted specifically by the Soviet insurrectionists who would have hyper-accelerated them, generating the viable threats, which would increase the need for the security mechanisms, such as the security protocols, which would be a part of the faculty structure of the malls themselves, protected against the viable threats inherent to the degeneracy of the roving mobs, which would naturally ascend in retaliation from that malice and degenerate inferiority. The raving lunatics of the undead, seeing life, see the glinting flare upon it like an overly bright light, raise their hand and block it as much as they do everything viable or possible for them to destroy it until they break and shatter and put to darkness the light that once so burned them. Now, David's position with this, according to their own estimates with the Jeff Bezos Amazon arrangements, presumes the position that he would have hyper-accelerated the viable product of their commerce, and therefore the exponential increase of the potential from those various exchanges, which they would have actively cooperated upon secret algorithms and agreements which would have been fundamental to many trading operations, which then, being essential for the exchange of commerce and sales, would then materialize the function of the total potential viable product of that system in the highly secured areas, that allowing the general public into their home village in the mall and its surrounding mechanisms, includes the function of the skyscrapers attached to the malls, which, having been accelerated to the position of material security castles, would then have the full protections naturally assumed to any of these valuable benefits. To this extent, the total viable product of each commercial benefit requires them to have received a superior wage in order to have paid for a superior cost of living, which would have been indoctrinated into their various uh, services, which they would have been protected by their overall contracts, which would be reinforced by any of the loans that they would have needed from David, which would have put David's bank in charge of that, guaranteeing the need for the network interest, which includes their higher wages, which, in David's being replaced people by the white supremacists, would not provide such luxurious benefits as it would be concentrated for their specific purpose of their superior genetic separation as a different species, and therefore generate the position of the right type of whites, hyperconcentration of the redirection when they collapse the market, and then protect themselves by socializing the losses of the white supremacists and engage in the total vulnerabilities to the general public as the massive wealth transfer is derived specifically in favor of the communists who have centrally planned the economy and enforced it violently. Many benefits inherent to the system would have had to have incorporated more services, included the carnival, which would then materialize the function of the increase of the musical tours as a variation or side piece of the carnival, which then would have its own little subroutines for the children in different groups that were not specifically there for the music, at which point the malls themselves would specifically be crafted to the uh, audio needs, as the structure themselves would be crafted for the express amplification of any of the music that would be happening in the live play, which then materializes the function of the superiority of said tours, which would travel from one mall to another. This then, presumably, as a total network, would have expanded itself very early in the combination of the compounding services, such as the taking over of YouTube, which they assumed David would do, which would then allow them to engage in the function of the distribution of the education structure, not just the function of the School of Hard Knocks, but any of the other mechanisms, such as the tutoring and whatnot, which then would generate the position of their particular advancements of reports or whatnot, which then hyper compound on each other exponentially as they develop the function of each of them, being able to upgrade them systematically until they've materialized the entirety of the essential data towards their core identity, materializing the ascension of their specialty, which would then be expressed to wherever they would be selling themselves to serve, such as for the function of getting a business loan, which then would rely upon these functions, estimating viable products of their capabilities, which would then express a more productive use through the function of early access to the data, which includes the function of early editing structures, which would have been hyper invested into, especially connected to David's connection with Steve Jobs, according to the obstructed values, which includes the hyper investment into Next as a viable product, which would have been essential to many of the business structures inside of the network, which then would specialize in these editing structures, allowing for the hyper custom personalized position Steve Jobs is exponentially known for to be applied to those structures commonly accessible by the general public, especially those more entwined into the network itself, which would then hyper accelerate the hyper refined and edited and perfected uh, video structures, which would materialize the function of being able to entertain themselves through any extreme emergencies, which inherently would be a thing that would be an active, viable threat to them, as something that has been infused into many of their persons that have been raised in the fart that is the general collective consciousness of any random threat being generated or crafted, as is derived by the undead ghouls from the Neo clan applying their white supremacist communism, putting them in danger. Now, this being understood as a collective whole was noticed by a character that refers to themselves as Jack Dorsey, which, according to the Twitter files, would have specifically understood the goal of the white supremacist communism, stating that they needed to attack David in the communists maliciously in order to have purged him, lest he have access to these abilities, which would by himself utterly eradicate everything they intended on doing, as they are collectively as a nation of white supremacists known as the Invisible Empire of the Confederacy, is weaker than he is by himself, without the obstruction, and therefore, if they had allowed him to have his faculties and not manipulated the government in the seizures and the various abuses and injuries derived by that mechanisms in their criminal activities and takings, by the misuse of government, by defrauding the records systematically, then they, as a collective system, would stand no chance, as their inherent degenerate inferiority, fundamental to their core identity, would not be able to sustain itself against a more vigorous actor in the economy.